Testing, testing, testing. It's a great pleasure for me today to return to Japan and to return to Tokyo, where I have Japanese friends by marriage and Japanese relatives by marriage and many Japanese friends and colleagues, some of whom I'm happy to see are in the audience today. I'd like to tell you how the story of my life led to my devoting myself to geography and environment and communicating about environmental issues to the public. I was born in the American city of Boston in 1937, and I grew up during World War II. Growing up during World War II meant that I grew up with geography constantly in my face. On the wall of my bedroom, my father pinned up two maps, a map of the European War Theater and a map of the Pacific War Theater, and every day Dad moved the pins on the maps to show the shifts of battle lines in those two theaters. One of my first childhood memories at the age of 5 was of the first photograph that the American Army released of dead American soldiers killed in battle, of soldiers lying face down in the surf on Buna Beach in New Guinea. When I was 7 years old, we opened and liberated the Nazi concentration camps, and were shocked to discover enormous piles of dead bodies of starving prisoners, so many bodies that they could not be buried individually, but that we had to have bulldozers to push them into trenches, that at the age of 7. Those memories of my childhood impressed me early with what geography does to the lives of people. As a result of growing up during the war, I thought that I could never marry a woman who had not also grown up during the war, because she would not understand my life and my outlook. In fact, my Polish-American wife, Marie, was born in 1948 after the end of the war, but the war was an even more vivid secondhand experience for her than it had been for me, because Marie's mother had survived Auschwitz concentration camp, and her father had survived a Russian prisoner of war camp. My 4 years living in Europe as a graduate student in the late 1950s and early 1960s reinforced my understanding of how strongly geography molds our human lives. My European friends, like me, were mostly born around the year 1937, but the lives of all of them were scarred directly by the war. They had variously been orphaned, or they lost brothers and fathers, or they watched their parents' house being bombed, or their education had been foreshortened. None of those things had happened to me, not because of my greater skill, but due entirely to the geographic accident of my having grown up in the United States, while my friends had had the misfortune to grow up in Britain, or Germany, or Russia, or Finland, or Yugoslavia, or Japan. That rubbed into me again the lesson of what geography could do to people, a lesson that I was going to rediscover when I began working in New Guinea. My father was a physician. My mother was a teacher and a linguist. Both of my parents were first and second generation immigrants to the United States from Eastern Europe. I learned different things from each of my parents. From my father, from my physician father, I learned my love of science. My mother taught me how to read when I was 3 years old and taught me writing style by correcting my school compositions every week for a dozen years. Also from my mother came my love of learning languages, of which I started learning what will prove to be my last language, my 13th language, at the age of 61. My mother also started me on piano lessons when I was 7 years old, and later I started playing the viola and playing the organ. I had fantasies of developing a second career as a musician. I came to realize that I didn't have the talent to be a professional musician, but I've remained an amateur musician, playing piano in chamber music groups, and my musical training has proved valuable for me in my work on birds. It's made me skilled at identifying New Guinea bird songs, which I've learned to describe in musical terms. Finally, I have one sibling, a younger sister, to whom I was constantly explaining things when we were children, growing up together. And that may have contributed to my love now in constantly trying to explain things to a broad public. After attending college, I pursued a PhD in a laboratory science, the laboratory science of physiology, at the University of Cambridge in England, where I studied salt and water transport on the gallbladder, the small organ buried in our liver. Now, the gallbladder itself is not an important organ, but its transport mechanisms proved to be similar to those of much more important organs like the liver and the kidney, but the gallbladder is easier to study because of its anatomy. Now, the essence of laboratory science is to do manipulative experiments, to change the conditions on one side and to keep the condition constant on the other side. For example, by putting a gallbladder into solutions either with or without potassium salts. That's comparisons that the scientist creates herself or himself. Comparisons also became my method of study when I began studying bird ecology and human history, as I'll explain to you. I became one of the world's leading experts on gallbladder physiology, a distinction for which I faced very few rivals in the world, very few competitors. I obtained a professorship at the University of California in Los Angeles Medical School with the responsibility of teaching medical students and doing experiments on the gallbladder. But it gradually dawned on me with increasing horror that the career course expected of me was to keep on devoting the rest of my life to the gallbladder. And that prospect of life seemed limiting. Fortunately, in 1963, a college classmate of mine who shared my love of bird watching, he and I cooked up together a trip to the Andes Mountains in Peru to go mountain climbing for adventure. And at the end of our mountain climbing in Peru, we went down to the Amazon basin to have more adventure in tropical rainforests where we had never been. In the Peruvian rainforest, we had the good fortune to be offloaded by a river steamer at the mouth of a small tributary river on which lived a village of a recently discovered tribe of Indians. In that Indian village, there was nothing for us to do except to talk with the Indians, which was fascinating, and to watch tropical rainforest birds, which was equally fascinating. We loved it. We published 2 papers, my first bird papers, on our bird observations. Now, could we please see the photographs of New Guinea? These are taken by my long-term colleague in New Guinea, David Bishop, with whom I've been working in New Guinea since 1986. And these pictures will go on as background. I'm not going to explain them one by one. In the summer of 1964, after my classmate and I had gone to the Amazon, we sought more extreme rainforest adventures on the tropical island of New Guinea. Why New Guinea? Because New Guinea then ranked as the wildest and least known part of the world, with several million tribespeople who had only recently been discovered by the outside world, still using stone tools and chronically at war with each other. That appealed to our thirst for adventure. New Guinea is an ideal field for a bird watcher and for a geographer for several reasons. New Guinea is home to the world's most remarkable birds, the birds of paradise, of which you're going to see a couple of pictures on these slides. New Guinea has high mountains, 5,000 meters high, but New Guinea is located on the equator. And that means that New Guinea is one of only 3 places in the world where there is snow on the equator, on the tops of high mountains, the other 2 being the Andes of South America and Mount Kilimanjaro in Kenya in East Africa. As you ascend a mountain in New Guinea, starting out at sea level, you climb up in the course of just a few kilometers. You climb from tropical rainforest through oak forest. Higher you come into the beech forest. Higher you come into the coniferous forest. Higher you come into the alpine grassland. And finally, at 4,700 meters, you reach the snow, but you've walked only a few kilometers. To traverse that series of habitats from rainforest to snow at sea level requires going 11,000 kilometers from the equator to the poles. But as a gallbladder physiologist, I now had to devise different methods to study New Guinea birds. It's possible, and it's morally acceptable, to add potassium salts to the solutions bathing a gallbladder. But it's not possible, or it's difficult, and it's not morally acceptable, and it's illegal to manipulate bird populations experimentally. And so instead of carrying out the manipulative experiments of laboratory science to understand New Guinea birds, I came to rely on natural experiments for my bird studies. By natural experiments, I mean that instead of locally exterminating the population of a bird species, mountain mouse babblers, in order to measure the effect of that species on the lowland mouse babbler, instead of that manipulation, I compared mountains where, due to natural conditions, chance, extinctions, and colonizations, the lowland mouse babbler lived either together with or without the mountain mouse babbler. That's a natural experiment, not a manipulative experiment. I was to learn to resort to similar natural experiments when I began to study human history seriously. From 1964 onwards, I've been returning to New Guinea every year and a half to study birds. Initially, my New Guinea studies were pure science, studies of bird evolution, ecology, and behavior, always sprinkled with adventure and undesired danger. The discovery for which I'm best known among ornithologists was my rediscovery of New Guinea's long-lost mystery bird, the golden-fronted bowerbird, previously known only from 4 skins that had turned up in a Paris hat shop, and that I discovered on top of the remote uninhabited Foya Mountains in 1981, where I had been airlifted in by helicopter. Soon, though, I found myself increasingly concerned that the New Guinea birds and forests that I loved were under threat from destructive human activities, as are animals and plants elsewhere in the world. And so I contributed to founding the emerging science of conservation biology by using bird distributions on islands in the ocean as models for creating national parks, by incorporating virtual islands of forest, natural forest, surrounded by an ocean of human-altered habitat. My largest opportunity to apply island biogeography to national park design has been in Indonesia, New Guinea, where I began working in 1979. At that time, the Indonesian government was just about to divide up Indonesia, New Guinea into forests, lands for forestry, lands for mines, and lands for national parks. And so when I arrived in Indonesia in 1979, the Indonesian government gave me $1,000 and 1 month and told me to travel around New Guinea and come up with recommendations for a national park system. Now, $1,000 and 1 month is absurdly little in order to figure out national park design for a big complex island like New Guinea. But I was able to supplement my $1,000 in 1 month with information about New Guinea biogeography to come up with a national park plan. I've spent most of the last 40 years exploring my planned national parks in Indonesia, New Guinea, and I've seen much of my plan adopted as the national park system for Indonesia, New Guinea. At least as important to me as what New Guinea birds have taught me about biogeography is what New Guinea people have taught me about human societies and about how to conduct my own life. New Guinea has 1,000 different tribes and languages, each of them different from each other, but all of them different from the modern industrial societies of Japan and Europe and the United States. In New Guinea, there are universal human problems that we have in the US and Japan, problems of raising children and growing old and staying healthy and facing dangers, but those problems are solved differently in New Guinea from the ways that we take for granted. New Guinea solutions for those universal problems have shaped my own attitudes towards danger and towards raising my own children and other features of daily life. But the most fundamental and most puzzling feature of traditional New Guinea life was their less advanced technological development compared to Japan and the United States and modern industrial societies. Traditional New Guinea societies had no metal tools, they had stone tools. They had no writing, they had no kings, they didn't even have chiefs. As a result, New Guineans used to be considered a so-called primitive people. Why did they end up with the stone tools? Was that because New Guineans are less intelligent than Westerners, as racists and colonial administrators often assumed? When I arrived in New Guinea in 1964, it took me only a day or two to realize that New Guineans appear on the average to be at least as intelligent, curious, and quick to learn as are Americans. Why then were New Guineans the ones to end up with the stone tools and no writing, whereas I, representative of a literate metal tool using society, I can't even find my way around in the New Guinea jungle or light a fire when it's raining without the help of a New Guinean. Eventually, in 1972, a New Guinean named Yali, with whom I was chatting, asked me point blank, why is it that you white people came to New Guinea bringing cargo meaning material goods, when we New Guineans didn't have cargo ourselves? Why did advanced technology develop in Europe, the United States, and not in New Guinea? I didn't know the answer then. It took me 25 years to come up with the answer to that big question. Around the year 1980, when I was 43 years old, my scientific interest began to shift. I began publishing articles about questions of history and geography, human history, in popular science magazines, thereby trying to explain those broad questions not just to my little sister and to myself, but to the broad public. There were two events that accelerated that career shift for me. The first of those events was a phone call out of the blue. Out of the blue meaning unexpectedly out of the sky. The phone call to me from the Asahi Glass Foundation announcing that I would receive the Blue Planet Prize was for me a surprise, unexpected, out of the blue. In 1985, I had received another phone call out of the blue. That was from the MacArthur Foundation in the United States, telling me that I had won a MacArthur Fellowship, which meant 5 years of support to do whatever I wanted. Initially, of course, I was delighted to get piles of money for 5 years, and then quickly I became depressed, deeply depressed for a week, for the only time in my life, because normally I'm optimistic and full of plans to do things. Why did the MacArthur Foundation call telling me that I had 5 years of money send me into a depression? It was because the call seemed to be saying, Jared, you haven't been living up to your potential so far. We, the MacArthur Foundation, expect you to do more important things in life than study gallbladders. You're already 48 years old. When are you going to start doing something important for the world? That was the first of the two events that precipitated my career shift, and the other event was in 1987, the birth of Marie's and my twin sons, Max and Joshua. I had already written articles about world problems, and you know all the accounts of world problems, that by the year 2050, climate change will have raised temperatures so and so much rainforest will be destroyed by the year 2050. But remember, I was born in the year 1937. The year 2050, to me, was an imaginary year. I'm not going to be alive then. But my twin sons, born in 1987, are very likely to be alive in 2050. They'll only be 63 years old then. They'll be approaching the peak of their lives. Their lives in 2050 are not going to depend on my discoveries about gallbladders. Their lives are going to depend upon history and geography. What could I do to help create a better world for my sons? Well, the MacArthur Foundation Award and the birth of my sons made me decide to try to live up to my potential and to influence my sons' future world by writing books for a broad international public. I began the first of these books, entitled The Third Chimpanzee, after my son's birth. That book is about apparently uniquely human features that differentiate us from animals. Human features like art and grammatical language and genocide. But it's only 5 million years ago that the human evolutionary line and the chimpanzee evolutionary line separated from each other. So those apparently uniquely human features like art and language must have emerged gradually from animal precursors over the last 5 million years. That was the subject then of my book, The Third Chimpanzee, and I still look back on that, my first book for a broad public, as my most enjoyable and best written book. My next book, published in 1997, Guns, Germs, and Steel, has proved to be my most influential book. It finally addressed the question that had been on my mind ever since my first visit to New Guinea and ever since Yali had asked me in 1972, why did you white people, but not us New Guineans, develop so much cargo? Historians haven't addressed this question, although it's the biggest question of history. In the absence of a convincing answer, many or most people fell back on racist explanations. Different people differ physically in their skin color and in their hair form. So maybe they also differ inside their skulls, in their intelligence and IQ, and maybe that's why Europeans developed the cargo. That answer had remained popular despite the failure of generations of racist scholars to document genetically higher IQs of Europeans, and despite what seemed to me like the at least equal intelligence of New Guineans. But cargo, meaning technology, metal tools, cargo as well as writing and central government didn't arise from the blue. It arose from a chain of causes, of which the crucial step was the adoption of agriculture. Until 11,000 years ago, all humans everywhere in the world were hunter-gatherers, hunting wild animals and gathering wild plants. Beginning around 11,000 years ago, hunting and gathering gradually evolved unconsciously into agriculture because human processing of wild plants and animals domesticated them. That's to say, unconsciously modified them so as to control their reproduction and so as to make them more useful to us humans. But only a small fraction of wild plants and animals can be domesticated. And those few wild plants and animals are concentrated in 9 or 10 parts of the world, like the Fertile Crescent, China, and Mexico. So those parts of the world got a head start on the population explosion caused by agriculture and on food surpluses to feed inventors and to feed kings and bureaucrats. That's to say, agriculture was the essential trigger for the development of cargo and writing and central government. In short, Eurasian people ended up with more cargo because of their good luck of biogeography, not because of their brains or anything else about the biology of Eurasian peoples themselves. Well, Guns, Germs, and Steel won the 1998 Pulitzer Prize for general nonfiction. I quickly followed it with my shortest book, Why is Sex Fun?, about the evolution of human sexuality, while Guns, Germs, and Steel has been my most successful book. Why is Sex Fun?, to my surprise, became my least successful book. Why? Because bookstores, from the title of the book, Why is Sex Fun?, thought that in bookstores it belonged into the erotica section of sex books and sex manuals, where anybody picking it up will not see pictures and explanations of different postures, but will just see boring explanations of sexual evolution. In 2002, I completed my career shift by closing my laboratory of experimental physiology, by moving from UCLA's medical school to its geography department, and ever since I've been teaching geography to my undergraduates, who serve as guinea pigs on whom to try out the ideas of each of my next books. I found that it's much better to try out my ideas on friendly students first before I publish a book, rather than by angry reviewers after I publish the book. Since closing my laboratory and moving to the geography department, I've written 4 books aimed at the broad public. In 2005, my book Collapse, discussing why some past societies have destroyed themselves by destroying their environmental resource base. And that's obviously a book full of lessons for the world today as we destroy our environmental resource base. Then my book in 2012, The World Until Yesterday, comparing traditional societies, like New Guinea societies, with our modern industrial society with respect to universal human problems like raising children, dealing with old age. And my most recent book that just appeared in Japan, October 28th, and in the United States in May, discusses national political crises in 7 modern nations, including Japan and the United States and the whole world, viewed from the perspective of the personal crises that confront all of us as individuals, and that have been a specialty of my clinical psychologist wife, Marie, working with her clients struggling with personal crises. All of these books of mine, written for the public, employ the comparative method based on natural experiments. I was able to carry out manipulative experiments on gallbladders in the laboratory, but I can't manipulate human societies. I can't manipulate all Americans living west of the Mississippi River and leaving as unmanipulated control all Americans living east of the Mississippi River. I had to resort to natural experiments, as in my studies of birds. Well, most historians publish books that are single case studies of one country in a short time span, like a book on 19th century Italy. That single case method and my comparative method offer different advantages and different disadvantages. In a single case study of 19th century Italy, you can devote the whole book to one country. In a comparative book like mine, with just a chapter on one country, you can devote less space to that country, but the comparative method poses questions and suggests perspectives that you can't get from a single case study. And that advantage is the basis of the quip: the historian who studies just one society ends up understanding no society. To date, my books have appeared in 40 languages, including all of the major languages of book publishing, plus small markets like the language of Azerbaijan and Mongolian and Estonian. Writing a book for the public requires that an author develop a thick skin, as Eric has also discovered, because some reviewers are really nasty. In compensation, though, public writing can influence the world. Each day I get emails from students who've been reading my books, and at each public lecture, I'm approached by people who tell me that my books changed their lives. In fact, those people have included at least 4 married couples who told me that they met each other as a result of discovering on their first date that both of them were reading my book, Guns, Germs, and Steel. So what lies ahead for me? Now at age 82, I'm still returning to New Guinea to study birds. I'm still teaching University of California undergraduates. I'm still planning my next book. The world's problems are still becoming more serious at accelerating rates. We humans are still currently harvesting our world planet's resources unsustainably at rates that can't be continued for more than a few decades. But at the same time, our efforts to solve the world's problems are accelerating. How is it all going to end? We'll know by the year 2050. We don't know now because we can't predict the choices that the world's people will make in the near future. But every one of you here who has children or grandchildren or hopes to have children, every one of you holds a personal investment in the future of our world. Those of us who are scientists and who can and want to write in language that the public understands can play a key role in influencing the public's choices. There are especially 2 things that give me hope in the face of all of the depressing things that you see in the world. One of those things that gives me hope is increasing public recognition of the world's problems, especially public recognition on the part of young people. And the other thing giving me hope is the increasing recognition of environmental problems by big profit-making businesses. A few decades ago, we environmentalists thought of big businesses as evil, as damaging to the environment, as the source of the world's troubles. But within the last 20 years, big American and international companies like Walmart and Chevron and Unilever have begun to devote themselves to environmental matters because they recognize that solving environmental problems is good for them. That's been within good for them and good for the whole world. That's been within the last 20 years. But think of this prize today, the Asahi Glass Foundation Prize, the Blue Planet Prize. The money for this prize is not coming from a private, non-profit charity. The money for this prize is not coming from an environmental, non-governmental organization like World Wildlife Fund. The money for this prize is coming from Asahi Glass, which is a profit-making large business. But Asahi Glass realized already by the year 1992, long before Walmart and Chevron and Unilever, that the world's environmental problems were also problems of Asahi Glass, because Asahi Glass employees are humans who suffer from the world's environmental problems like all other humans, and also because solving environmental problems is good and profitable for the bottom line of Asahi Glass, as well as being good for the whole world. Those are the 2 things that give me hope and that I think also gives Eric hope. Those things, and especially the change in attitudes in recent decades of big businesses, motivate Eric and me to keep studying environmental problems and to keep writing for the public. I thank you for honoring me with the Blue Planet Prize. Thank you.